This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
The great cultural theorist Stuart Hall suggested identity is not just a state of being, but a state of becoming. And it's this state of becoming that inspires Dr. Kenneth Montague, who curates the new show, Becoming, the photography of the Wedge Collection. And we're here today with Dr. Kenneth Montague at the Nasher Museum in Durham, North Carolina at Duke University. You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we're here today with a very special guest in what is a very special episode of Left of Black. We're here at the Nasher Museum at Duke University, and we're here for the opening of the show, Becoming, the photography of the Wedge Collection. And we're here with the Wedge Collection's owner, curator of Becoming, Dr. Kenneth Montague. How are you doing today, Ken?
Just fine, Mark. It's great to be here. Great to be on your show.
And let me begin. We're standing here in front of the work of Malik Sidibe, and one of the reasons why I love Sidibe's photography, it's classic in the sense that you get this feel of that first decade after independence, right? I mean, all his stuff kind of has that feel, but it also has this real cosmopolitan feel, right? It's kind of a mode of blackness that many folks don't know even exists, and a lot of that speaks to your own experience, right? You were born and raised in Toronto.
Actually, born and raised in Windsor, across from Detroit.
And that's what I wanted to talk about.
Close to Toronto.
I have a good friend, Richard Eiton, who teaches political science at Northwestern, and he's a Black Canadian also, and he talks about what it was like growing up in places like Windsor and having access to American soul music in Detroit. And I think a lot of that kind of flavor, this kind of cosmopolitan flavor of Black Canadian and African American Motown Detroit really comes out in some of the work that's in your collection. And as I understand it, the term Wedge Collection comes from the fact that you started collecting art, right? You're a dentist.
I am.
Right, that's your everyday job.
I already saw your teeth, and they're looking good. Mark's teeth are looking good.
Thank you.
Just want to let everyone know that. His teeth are looking good. Anyway,
but you started collecting in the 90s, and you showcased them in a space that was a wedge.
Yes, it's true. It was a wedge-shaped space in my home, which was a loft in Toronto, downtown, and that wedge space also had a kind of a double meaning. The idea was to wedge artists into the mainstream of the contemporary art world. So that was the appropriate word for that art project.
And so, what's very interesting about, the work that you're doing, on the one hand, that you had the sensibility to begin to collect.
Oh, thank you.
There's really a new generation of young Black entrepreneurs and other folks who are looking at the value of collection. I think about Grant Hill, the NBA player who's, here from Duke, someone like Jay-Z, who can't stop telling folks about how many Basquiat's that he
actually ran into him and Beyonce at a gallery in New York, and we were buying the same thing, so that made me feel good.
And it's interesting, right, because it really is a re-articulation of how folks think about building wealth, right?
Yes,
you can buy 2 more cars, you can buy 2 more Maybachs, right? Or you can buy 2 Basquiat's, right? And Basquiat is, towards buying wealth, right? Because the value increases and it's something very different. What has it been like, trying to tell the world that you're a Black collector?
It's a very interesting question.
When you walk into galleries, it's like that classic, Black man in the drugstore. Yes, may we help you? Right?
Actually, it's a great question. And the experience that I had early on was just that. I remember being shooed out of a major gallery in Toronto. In fact, the gallery owner put one of the little interns on me too. The poor little girl was like,
following you around, right? Like you're gonna walk out with some none of you.
Can I help you? And she was just all, almost so scared and like, you have to leave. And I was like, so then it was only 3 weeks later that something was in the national newspaper in Canada talking about a Van der Zee show, James Van der Zee, that I had put on in Toronto. And that same gallery owner then called me, not knowing it was the guy that she shooed out of the gallery. Gotcha. I have lots of Van der Zees here for sale. So, it's just going to go with the territory. But I feel like most people recognize that there's an importance to a lot of the artists in my collection these days. But when I started back in the mid-90s, it was very out of fashion to be collecting identity art, you know? It was like kind of, it had its moment, as you know, with Glenn Ligot and Lorna Simpson and
Carrie May.
Carrie May, and you know, in England there were other artists that were talking about these ideas around black identity, but it's sort of where the art world was concerned, the art market, it kind of was like, yeah, that was then, and you know, we got a few names, and we've moved on, and but you know,
post-black as Delma would talk,
post-black, and I'm with that too. But I feel like, you know, it can be inclusive. You don't want to just let that stuff go that was important, and for me, it was very important. It's the stuff that drew me into contemporary art as a dentist who started collecting. You can laugh, but there's a reason that I have this collection. It's probably more being a dentist.
Well, you know, and it's interesting, right? Because it's like, it's just reminded, like, you don't have to be a rapper.
So true.
Right?
So true.
You know, you can just go to dental school, right?
That is,
be good at your craft and build your wealth, you know, collecting art. We're here on Left of Black. We're joined by Dr. Kenneth Montague, who is the curator and owner of the Wedge Collection. We're here at the Nasher Museum at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, for the opening of the show, Becoming, the photographs of the Wedge Collection. The inspiration for the title of the collection, of this particular show, Stuart Hall. And this notion, and a bunch of us, you know, the idea. What's up, Stuart? By the way, we've never met, but I love your work. And actually did a really nice piece on the insurrections in Britain. So it's nice to see him still out there, you know, being engaged in many ways. But he talks about this idea that identity is something of becoming, right? It's not something static, right? It's always
being and
developing, right? Yeah,
it continues. It's not this static thing. It grows. You know, it's defining it as a hard thing. It's about being where you are, where you were, where you're going. And so I'm trying to sort of work with that idea in presenting these works from my collection. The idea is just to say, you know, what is it? Who am I? That's the start of it. Like, as a collector, I'm sort of going, who am I? Am I African Canadian? Am I Jamaican Canadian?
Right.
I guess I'm a little more Jafaican than Jamaican. But the idea is, you know, who are we? And you know, looking at black culture, you know, it's sort of, you know, there's this history, there's sort of movements that have taken place politically and otherwise, that, you know, style, movements of style, personal style. I'm trying to grab it all, and that's a difficult thing, but I'm trying to get little examples of each era that means something to me personally.
And you're really piecing together a history of blackness, right? Particularly in the photogenic representation, the image of blackness. And I know for young folks, you know, we're here now, and there are kids from EK Poe, which is a local public school here in Durham, and the idea that they can have contact with us at a young age, all these very rich images,
I really
of blackness.
Think that's great.
And it's not the stuff you're going to see on BET or even on YouTube. And
this is the thing, that it was, the whole Wedge project was a kind of a counterpoint to what I grew up with in Windsor, across from Detroit, getting those American stations and seeing those shows like Good Times and Sanford and Son and What's Happening. And, you know, hey, Raj. I'm like, I don't live like that. My family's not like this. I grew up in a middle-class family in Canada. You know, I just didn't really, you know, relate to that. I thought it was funny, you know, but it wasn't me.
It wasn't totality, right? It's not the totality of blackness.
So, you know, I mean, I was growing up going to the Detroit Institute of Arts because luckily I had parents that were sensitized and sort of into that art scene. And they just, you know, they were immigrants from Jamaica. My mom was a dietitian. My dad was a teacher who was doing his master's in Detroit. So we, like many Canadians, we lived in Windsor, but you know, then you'd go across, especially if you're a black Canadian, and there's a few of us, you're not going to live in America. This is like pre-civil rights. This is like 50s to early 60s.
You're not going to do that, right?
Yeah, you know, I was born in the 60s, but, you know, my parents were not going to be living in America, even in the North at that time. Coming from Jamaica, no. So, you know, you use the resources. So go to that Detroit Institute of Arts, go to the library, go to Cranbrook, you know, and he was learning about, he did a master's of industrial arts, so he was working with design and art, so it's really in my blood, you know. I mean, I ended up working with my hands as a dentist, but the idea of appreciating wood and design and, you know, these things are all part of me, and I think it informs what I do.
Absolutely. One of the artists that's in the collection, James Van Der Zee. And, you know, the idea that someone over a course of a career could lend Jack Johnson in 1912.
Something.
And then one of the most iconic photos from the Harlem Renaissance, you know, black man and woman wearing their fur coats.
With a couple of raccoon coats.
Right, high Negro style,
oh, yeah.
right? You know, as Andre Harrell would refer to it. But then also Basquiat.
Yeah, in his lifetime.
In his lifetime. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary, right? And what has become, you know, the definitive, really, photograph of Basquiat. Right, you know, as Basquiat's reputation has grown, you know, everyone has seen that photo, right? You know,
it's funny. I have to tell you a funny story that Trevor Schoonmaker, who's the curator here in-house at the Nasher Museum, he related to me when we presented this photo as part of the show. He was like, you know, my friend Diego.
Diego,
you know, yeah. Diego Rivera, so you know the story.
Diego Cortez,
Diego Cortez. So he just kind of, you know, talked about that day because he was there with Basquiat, and they showed up at Vanderzee's studio, and of course 2 different generations. You know, Vanderzee was looking at Basquiat going like, "This is dirty-looking guy coming with this, you know, locks, and he's got all this paint all over his clothes. Like, you're here for a photo session. I'm trying to uplift the race."
And I'm James Vanderzee, right? I mean,
it's like it was just like respect, you know. And so there was that thing where it was like, you know, I think the shoot might not have happened if Diego hadn't lent his jacket.
Yeah.
He was wearing a jacket to Basquiat, who's wearing that jacket in the photo, which is really great.
Right.
So
and the cat shows up
and, you know,
unannounced.
He's got all those little props. He's got the original chair. So, I mean, it's really funny that, you know, there was this difference and sameness with 2 generations. Of, you know, and it's really, you can just draw that line, that trajectory of greatness in terms of art with, you know, someone from that Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance era, and someone later on in the 80s who really are working in the same arena when it comes to the art market, when it comes to, you know, the idea that, you know, at that moment, at that time, you're sort of seeing this thing, it looks different, and, you know, what is this about? And I think over time we realize the greatness of these artists, you know? Absolutely. I mean, it's just, at that moment, you can be seen as this ostracized figure. And very soon, if you're doing something special, something unique, something beautiful, everyone just understands. Now you got these 2 titans, like, and at that moment, Basquiat also was like, you know, I got to get a picture of you. So he then later did a painting of Vanderzee. So you got that nice parallel.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
You know, it's like boxing, you know, like just a little bit of this, a little bit of that, you know, it's great.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Dr. Kenneth Montague, who is the curator of the new show here at the Nasher Museum at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, Becoming. The photographs of the Wedge Collection, one of my other favorite artists, right? And let me just be honest, most of the artists that you have here are some of my favorite photographers. But I grew up in New York City in the 70s and the 80s. I went to high school in Brooklyn. And so Jamel Shabazz's photographs, his book back in the day, you know, now the 10th anniversary collection is out. And, you know, I go back to those photos, and before anybody even has a name for hip hop, before anyone's talking about hip hop style or hip hop, before anybody knows what swagger is, right? He's giving us a photographic representation of swagger. And not just a masculine swagger, right? A female swagger.
Oh,
and I look at these pictures like, you know, I think I went to school with that guy.
Yeah, it's so familiar.
It's so that's
familiar.
Exactly, it's so familiar, right?
I remember going to New York in 1985, visit my cousin, girls dressed up the same, like twins on the subway, Jordache jeans, you know what I'm saying?
And it's, you know, it's a great moment because it explains to folks who don't get it, right, where this moment comes from, right? I mean, these are just people trying to work and live, go to school, survive in a space, right? And the way that they, you know, translate that space to who they are, right? You know, so you can look at those pictures and it's like, even if there weren't photographs of black bodies or Latino bodies, you would know, you know, that's Black Brooklyn.
So true, so true. Right, so, you know, of its time and of its place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it really is situated in the middle of this show, physically, geographically, because it's sort of, in a lot of ways, the heart of my collection. It's something that's in that great line between the classic early studio photography, where it's very formal and set up, and the kind of postmodern, almost post-identity shots that close the show, which are a little more conceptual. Jamel's somewhere right in the middle where you know there's that nice interplay between the artist and the subject, where it's sort of like, you know, they're posing and they're choosing the poses themselves, and he's saying, no, give me a little more flavor, you know? And then, you know, he wants a little more of a lead, you know, and there's a nice interplay, and it's sort of like, this is what Becoming's all about, like going from the early images where it's like absolutely no connection between the photographer and the subject, and you see the people that are indentured laborers in Jamaica working in that cane field just a minute after slavery, and you know, that picture is being taken for a European audience, and it's going to be a little postcard, and the people look like squirrels caught in the headlight, you know, they just, you know, versus toward the end where, you know, you got images like Micheline Thomas where she's positioning herself as a subject. She completely controls the environment that she's creating.
Carrie May's work, does the same thing.
You know, a wonderful antecedent to Micheline. You know? So Jamel's in the middle. He's doing a little interaction, but still putting his own flavor and looking for some flavor for the subject.
Absolutely.
It's a great kind of middle ground, ideal, you know, kind of prototype image for this show.
You've been watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined this afternoon by Dr. Kenneth Montague. He was the curator of the new show, Becoming, the photographs of the Wedge Collection, and the owner of the Wedge Collection.
My collection, yes. In Toronto, I might add.
In Toronto. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Ken. This is wonderful work that you're doing, and glad that you were able to take some time with us here on Left of Black.
It's an honor to be on your show and to meet you.
Thank you.
Take care, Mark. Peace.
I used to be good at this back in the days. So nice. My name is Jamel Shabazz. I'm a photographer. I've been using my camera for over 30 years to document the beauty and history of people. Thank you so much. It's hard as a photographer now because it's so common to have your picture taken. Everybody got a cell phone camera. My daughter got a cell phone camera. So it's like, you're not saying nothing slick to nobody no more.
That's good, you're using film. Wow, okay.
Jamel take that picture, it's going to definitely come out, and it's going to be right.
Y'all got to give me some flavor. Y'all from Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Y'all do look like y'all from Staten Island. Come on,
Not
Brooklyn.
Staten Island. Hell
Look
no.
at the pose. Let me give you some flavor.
I know that magic.
All right, that's cool. Olin? Okay, you say you wouldn't be working.
When it comes down to the negative side of life, you know, the drugs, the gangsters, the violence, enough of that stuff already. I'm looking for something different. People know me for having documented the 80s. That's my heart. My style was basically created by being sincere. I get people to smile. I don't want people to look thugged out. I don't do that. You know, I have people smile. So everybody puts on this facade of being hard, and they really not hard. Being compassionate with my subjects and listening to them, it produces a beautiful smile on the faces of my subjects. It creates an ambiance where everyone is relaxed. My subjects are smiling, they're at peace. You would think I've known them forever. Why? Because I made them feel comfortable. So you have to be sincere. When I approach people, it's about sincerity. You can't go no other way than that. There's a lot of love out here. As I travel throughout the city today, I'm still seeing it. And one thing about people that love each other, they kind of want to be photographed too. And especially now with the digital camera, I'm able to shoot it and then show it to them and say, wow, don't we look special? I think if you want to be successful and a successful street photographer, I think you need to slow down just a little bit. You need to slow down and be a little bit more patient, be a little bit more humble, and slow it down. There's no need to rush. I don't believe in rushing. And I got to pause because I got to get the shot here, and I got to be very quiet. Right now. Oh, that's a classic.
Welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Kellie Jones, Associate Professor in the Department of Art, History, and Archaeology at Columbia University, the author of several books and exhibition catalogs, including Energy Experimentation, Black Artists and Abstraction, 1964 to 1980, Basquiat from 2005, Lorna Simpson, which she did with Thelma Golden and Chrissy Isles. And she's talking to us here today, particularly about her brand new book, Eyeminded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, which was just published this spring by Duke University Press. How are you doing today, Professor Jones?
I am doing very well, Professor Neal. Thank you.
So as we talk to you, you're preparing for the launch of a new exhibition out in California, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, which of course is going to be at the Hammer Museum at UCLA. And in some ways, you know, the new exhibition in the book, it allows you to really talk full circle about how you got into this world of art history, this world of curating. You, of course, are the daughter of Amiri Baraka and Kellie Jones. And you talk very early in the book, Eyeminded, about what it was like, you know, growing up around all this art. So tell our audience what it was like growing up around all of this art.
Well, you know, when you're a child, you think your whole world is what the whole world is. And it wasn't, and then growing up in New York, there's art everywhere, there's artists everywhere. And it was finally when I went to college that I realized that nobody else knew artists. And in fact, nobody else knew artists of color. Yeah. I actually had that revelation partially in high school. I went to what is now the Fiorello LaGuardia School of the in high school that had also performing and visual arts. And when we took art history, it seemed that the only people of color were ancient. They were Egyptians, they were, you know, pre-Columbians, right? They were ancient Americans, but they weren't contemporary people, even though in our classes, of course, being in New York, you had a good deal of, you know, of course, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos in your classes. So that seemed to be a conundrum to me. And I guess I went on the path from that time to say, hey, wait a minute, this history is wrong, and going about rectifying that.
There's a wonderful picture of you and your sister Lisa Jones that was shot at the Paula Cooper Gallery around 1969, and the two of you are just kind of playing around inside a gallery space. Talk a little bit about, you know, experiencing art as a child, but not just in terms of what you would come to know in terms of knowing artists and critics and what have you, but just think about art as a space of playfulness, of excitement, and as you talk about in the book, as a conduit towards community.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was just something that you took for granted, that people made things, that they were passionate about them, and they made all sorts of things, you know, songs, they made dances, they made paintings, and one of the things that I decided back in that time is they often spent their last dime on, you know, paint or a brush, and I said, that's not going to be me. But of course, I didn't land that far from the tree with that. But it was, I think what I got from that is the potential of creativity, and that people are creative. Yeah. And everybody has the potential to be creative. And so that's what I think I learned. But also that art was political, that it was about passion and it was about commitment.
We're talking this afternoon with Kellie Jones, professor of art history and archaeology at Columbia University, author of the brand new book, Eyeminded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, published this spring by Duke University Press. And of course, the curator of the soon-to-open show, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980. Kellie, Julie Dash was here a few weeks ago as we celebrated the 20th anniversary of Daughters of the Dust. And what I find very interesting is that, you know, when you think about your early career in art, and when she talked about when the filmmaking bug, you know, struck in her, both occasions occurred at a trip to the Studio Museum. Talk about what kind of institution the Studio Museum was, those early days with Mary Schmidt Campbell, excuse me. About how important a space it was in cultivating, not obviously a space, you know, obviously a space for black artists to be able to do what they do, but also to cultivate a desire and taste amongst young folks to be able to engage black art.
Right. Well, Studio Museum, begins in the late 60s. Mary Schmidt Campbell comes in about 10 years later. And I think the Studio Museum in Harlem, it's always been about connecting with the community, and being a place both to see art and to make art in the community, and also to bring artists into the community. It was very exciting when I first started working there, my first professional job after college in a museum. They were actually moving from their space on Fifth Avenue, which was a loft over a liquor store, to the building they have now. And it was very exciting to be, in on this new, this move of the museum. And I think, it still certainly is true to its creed of bringing art to that community, and then also now being really a global center for art. So it's very exciting to still see it surviving and being in the forefront of many things after all these years.
We're here with Professor Kellie Jones on Left of Black, Columbia University Professor of Art History and Archaeology, who's talking to us today about her new book, Eyeminded, Living in Contemporary Art, Duke University Press, published this spring. The book is broken up into 4 sections: diaspora, envisioning, making multiculturalism, and abstract truths. And it's a very collaborative process. I mean, you got your family involved, right? So your father contributes a piece or two to it. Your mother, Kellie Jones, your sister, Lisa, who of course is well known for her work at the Village Voice, and of course her book, Bulletproof Diva. And your partner, Guthrie Ramsey Jr., currently a professor of music at the University of Pennsylvania. What was it like trying to get the family, engaged in your work?
Well, because I've spent many years being a curator, I was well aware of the collaborative process of getting people together. But then you have to have a special sensitivity when you work with your family. I think the most interesting thing to me is that they were all kind of like, well, why do you want us? You've got all this writing. You don't need us to frame this. And what I had to do was really convince them that the frame was important and the frame was unique. I mean, who gets to do that? Who gets to talk about this? Yeah, right. And I think actually my partner, Guthrie Ramsey, was really very supportive when I told him this idea, because as he told me, well, people are going to write about this later after y'all are all gone, so you might as well get in on it. And I said, you're right. And it was really great. I'm so glad I did it, because now we have a document with all of us together that we collaborated on, when we were alive, So I really, it's been exciting, and it's really been exciting to see how they framed the work as well.
In that opening section on diaspora, I want to quote a little bit, paraphrase a little bit, something that you say about diaspora being an act of global African dispersion, right, and the will to reconnection. And thinking about diaspora not only in the literal sense, but also the conceptual sense, right? Restoration of origins, and migration as exodus, return as redemption. Talk a little bit how important it's been to bring these diasporic influences of Black art in conversation with African American art. I think for many African Americans, when they think African art, they think some of the most stereotypical examples of mask, and you're really talking about, the proliferation of conceptual art in Africa, work that folks like Salah Hassan, has written about, and folks of that nature.
Right. Well, I think my interest in diaspora, I mean, when you grow up in New York, it's there. You just take it for granted. And I think that was my framework. Well, in college, I majored in African American studies many, many years ago. And so we learned, this was my context. What I also have recently discovered, I mean, in college, I majored in art history, Latin American studies, and what they called at that time, Black studies. Mm-hmm. But what I realize now is that because of Latino migrations, or let's say migration from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic during the 60s and 70s, that my world, where I grew up, was was heavily Latino because of those migrations. And so I automatically, you know, heard these musics, saw things that I knew was about diaspora. And I think I've always been, again, from a young person, then studying it in college more formally and going on in graduate school to continue studying the same thing, that it was just a natural thing for me. I mean, if you hear, you know, music from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, there's no doubt that Africa is there. If you hear music from Cuba, there's no doubt Africa is there. Even Fidel Castro himself has said Cuba is Afro-Latin country, you know. So if it's there in music, we know that there are also ways that it is there in other cultural formations. And, you know, it's exciting to think about those, but then also that's kind of a historical look, but then also the contemporary, you know, migrations, people keep coming, you know, and also because my focus is really contemporary, 20th and 21st century. We want to look at contemporary artists in Africa. We want to look at contemporary artists in Britain that are part of the diaspora, in the Caribbean, and yes, even in South America as well. Believe me, you will find people of African descent, as you know, everywhere, and they're making something, you know.
We're here with Kellie Jones, author of the new book, Eyeminded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, Duke University Press, from the spring of this year. In that same section of diaspora, you talk about an exhibition that you had curated in the 1990s, Life's Little Necessities, installations by women, in which you look at the work of artists like Jocelyn Taylor and Lorna Simpson. And I was particularly struck by, you know, this reference that you make, you know, in reference to the rapper at the time, Da Brat, and this whole idea of talking back. And how women artists have been able to use the art to speak back. And I couldn't help juxtapose that, you know, to the recent controversy around, for instance, Serena Williams at the US Open, and how the larger society tends to not really deal well with Black women in particular saying what's on their mind.
Well, that exhibition was, it was great to do an exhibition in South Africa 3 years after the election of Nelson Mandela was really an honor. You know, when you grow up in a certain time period and, you know, you learn about apartheid and it's wrong and then it ends and you're part of, again, your cultural work is being framed by great political change. It was really an honor. Now, having said that, it was also very difficult. But what I wanted to do with that show was to, again, frame women as part of globalization, as part of transnationalism, specifically through their work. And so it was great to be able to present the work of, I think, 13 women in South Africa in 1997, of course, working with the great curator Okwe Nwezo, who was the artistic director of the Johannesburg Biennale, for whom I did the show, working in Cape Town, where after getting there, I found out there was a Black woman buried under the space where I was doing the show, you know, which was it was a prison, basically. Well, it was a fort, and of course there was a prison in there, and she was in prison and died there, named Kratoa. And so that kind of brought things full circle. So, you know, these women were kind of speaking, unbeknownst to them, back to that history. But you know, certainly we can connect it with the way women, as you mentioned with Serena Williams earlier this year, carry themselves, and earlier this week or the other day, her just questioning, you know, certain things becomes a whole, you know, you're not supposed to question.
Right.
So, but I'm glad we're living in that space now that we can as Black women and keep pushing that edge.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm host Mark Anthony Neal, and we're here with Professor Kellie Jones. Columbia University art historian, author of the new book, Eyeminded, and of course, curator of the new show, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, which of course will open at the Hammer Museum at UCLA in October. It's almost, cliche at this point, but, I'm talking to an art historian, a black art historian, so I have to ask you about Basquiat, who in some ways, more than 20 years after his death, may be, one of the most recognizable black artists in the world. So much so that someone like Jay-Z, regularly makes references to his Basquiats. And in even getting some inkling that on some sort of intellectual and philosophical level, that Jay-Z is trying to engage some of the work that Basquiat was doing. You mentioned in the book about meeting Basquiat for the first time at the Puck Building, at a party, that was given by Spike Lee and being introduced by Fab Five Freddy. What was your sense of Basquiat when you first met him? Vis-a-vis the art world, but more explicitly, of course, as a black artist. And what's your thinking about Basquiat now, 5 or 6 years after you were involved in the curation of that famous show, that was in Brooklyn and has traveled around the country?
Well, that was, another amazing moment and honor to meet him and to meet him on the dance floor. I love that. And, he was really, he was the star, and it was amazing. It was, in my lifetime, I hadn't seen an art star like that. And he was really, as his work tells us, very conscious, particularly, in the years right before his death, about diaspora. And it's sad for me that he didn't live to really share so much more with us that I know he had with him, inside of him, in terms of those ideas. But the work itself is so complex and so dense and in so many languages. I mean, he's, I teach him in my African-American artist class, but I teach him in my Caribbean artist class, and I teach him in my Latin American artist class. He fits everywhere. And I think he's the ultimate global artist citizen. And what's also important is that, of course, young artists all over the world are totally captivated by him. That project was amazing. I mean, to do it on the last weekend in Brooklyn, there were 40,000 people that saw that show on the last weekend.
Yeah,
I mean, as an academic, to do a project like that, there's nothing like that. But that was years ago. And of course, you mentioned Jay-Z. Swiss Beats now is doing the whole Reebok line with, him. But part of the, and other rappers have, put his name in their music. What's important to know about Jay-Z is he's also an art collector.
Right.
So part of it comes from that as well as just the artist as figure. But I think that's, it's really exciting to think about an artist being in contemporary, song. It's really amazing, and so that's very exciting to see how that legacy continues in so many different ways.
One of the things that you examine in the new exhibition is this arena of black abstract art, particularly amongst these artists working in Los Angeles. And of course, in the last section, your partner, Guthrie Ramsey, in his piece about free jazz, he begins the piece quoting, the artist Jack Whitten, that if you don't experiment, you die. Talk a little bit about that. There's this sense that, particularly if we look at it within the most popular realm, that black culture is fatigued, right? Fatigued by, the gangster ethos, fatigued by having to defend blackness, fatigued by Obama. There's this sense of fatigue. But yet, this show and your own work, and of course, Guthrie kind of citing it here, it's offering an out in this notion of experimentation.
Right. Well, I think the fatigue is representational fatigue.
Yeah.
It's hard to represent all day long. You want to go, that's the beauty of abstraction. You can just go somewhere that's unmarked.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Where you don't have to represent blackness or Obama or gangsta, you just represent color. And even then, somebody still say you represent it, but you could represent color, you can represent line. And I think ultimately, when you're talking about visual art, that's what people are dealing with.
Yeah, yeah.
They're dealing with the actual physical compositional structure of making either a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface or working in three-dimensional space. And so they go into those modes, you know. And it's very exciting to think about that, because also the other reason why that has been compelling to me is, again, these are people that I grew up with.
Right.
Without knowing it, these are the people that I babysat for, that I was around, that saw me as a child. I was always around abstract art, and I didn't even think that, I never had the concept that Black people didn't make it or couldn't make it or it wasn't part of their life.
Right.
That and music, Archie Shepp, you
Right.
know, it's like,
Right.
yeah, free jazz too. I mean, I love that. I have, you know, who are like, really? Well, because, you know, this is something that I grew up with. And so I never thought that it wasn't a possibility. And so, again, it's a space for where artists can really feel free in so many ways. And also interesting to explore, because again, Black artists don't only make representational work. I mean, that's just life. Right. You know, there are all different kinds of works to be thought about. So I was glad to be able to have a section where I could meditate on those ideas.
We're here on Left of Black with curator and author and professor, Columbia University, Professor Kellie Jones, talking about her new exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980 at the Hammer Museum at UCLA. What are you hoping to achieve with the show?
Well, the show, it's actually based on research a book that I'm also finishing on Los Angeles. So that came first, and I was just doing my research, and I ran into a curatorial colleague who said, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, I'm working on LA. Oh, are you going to do a show?" "Oh, yeah, one day." And then all of a sudden, boom, there's this big project called Pacific Standard Time that the Getty Foundation was sponsoring. And so my work fit in well. And basically, you know, I want to talk about, you know, the history of that time period between 1960 and 1980 in LA, and talk about experimentation. I think in my experience, or my research leads me to believe that the West Coast really had a lot of experimentation going on that then came to the East Coast. And we can even see it parallel with things like the Panther movement, right? The Black Panther Party. So many things come from the West Coast at that time. The US organization and cultural nationalism with Maulana Karenga coming from the West Coast. So I was looking about, you know, knowing about politics and social ideas at that time, and then looking at the art in California and really focusing on that. What's been very interesting is that in the press, as we're moving towards this kind of grand opening at in the beginning of October, with all these shows, there's 60 shows in museums and 120 exhibitions and galleries, all connected with Pacific Standard Time. But what people have been talking about, at least initially, is how the story has changed in terms of artists of color, non-white artists, their contributions to history. But what the focus has been, of course, is Chicano artists. There are a lot more shows of Chicano artists. There's a show on OSCO, there's many other shows. But, you know, we also want to say that, you know, African Americans were doing their thing too, as part of, you know, really expanding the discourse, not only about what West Coast art is, but about what American art is. And that is, you know, again, that goes back to all of my work so far. The other important thing about the show, it's called Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980. Now, some people say, well, what is Black Los Angeles, right? And like, okay. But what Black Los Angeles is, it's not only Black people in Los Angeles. Right. It's how African Americans in Los Angeles have affected the nation and the world.
The world, right.
You know, so this is also part of it. So in the show called Now Dig This, you know, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, we have Latinos in the show, we have white artists in the show, and we have Asian American artists in the show as well, because part of what I also want to talk about is the influence that African American artists had on
these folks, right, right.
So that's also, I think, the important part of what I wanted to do, whether it's connections by marriage in terms of artists like Daniel LaRue Johnson and Virginia Jaramillo, or political connections like John Otterbridge and Andrew Zermeño, who were working together in, you know, alternative spaces in communities. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve, basically expanding the notion of not only West Coast art, but American art in general.
Well, here's the hoping that my buddy here at Duke in the Nasher Museum, Trevor Schoonmaker, and you will connect at some point and bring the show east, because we'd love to have it here. We've been here with Kellie Jones, Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, the author of several books and exhibitions, including the exhibition catalogs, including the new book, Eyeminded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, Duke University Press, 2011, and the curator of the soon-to-open show, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, which will open at the beginning of October at the Hammer Museum at UCLA. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Kellie.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.